I want to focus on Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Powerful vision from the prophet Daniel. He sees a heavenly vision. But notice what he says in verse 13. It's powerful. He says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. Right? So he sees this person who he looks human. And he came with the clouds of heaven. This is what Jesus was talking about when he said to the high priest and to those that listened, and the high priest ripped his garments. Oh, blasphemy. Why was it blasphemy? Because the high priest understood what many of the Jews at the time and before that time knew that passage was speaking about. And he came to the Ancient of Days. There's distinction. And they brought him near before him. And what was given to him? Dominion and glory and a kingdom. It sounds exactly like Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6. That all people, nations and languages, everybody should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom which shall not be destroyed. Daniel saw this and he was grieved. Like he didn't know what to do with it. He was so undone by this vision. He sees earlier in the passage the Ancient of Days seated on the throne. And then he sees one like this. He sees this person who's like, there's a human, but he's riding the clouds. He's human, but he's divine. Unto us a child is given. Unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. But that one will be called the mighty God, El Gibor. He will be called Yahweh. These are the passages which push us as faithful Bible students, Bible believers, to say Jesus is God, but he's also taken on a physical form. Why am I talking about this passage today? Because he mentions this passage in this book. And he mentions a very intriguing story. This isn't the only place, like, this isn't the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, which, like, I don't want to say that now, but it's in the Talmud. A very fascinating story about one of Judaism's most famous rabbis, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is like the creme de la creme, especially in that period. But you'll hear about Rashi, right? Rabbi Akiva is on that level. Very, very significant rabbi. Like top 2, top 3. Rabbi Akiva. Notice though what Boyarin says in his book, which is interesting. This passage Jesus applied to himself, right? So as Christians who believe in the New Testament, we obviously believe this is about Jesus, but the Jews know this is about the Old Testament, about the Messiah who is human but divine as well. Now, obviously there's the interpretation that a lot of rabbinic Jews have today that no, this isn't about the Messiah, this is about the nation of Israel. And they do the same thing with Isaiah 53. No, this is not about the Messiah, even though most of the rabbis of ancient history said it was about Messiah. No, this is not about Messiah, this is about Israel. And this goes back to one of the main theses he talks about in this book, about rabbinic Judaism coming out of, like, being created and saying, no, we need to distinguish. We need to separate ourselves from Christians. Now, look, I'll be honest. People in the name of Christ, people naming the name of Christ, have done some of the most terrible things to Jews. So that plays a big part in why some Jews decided, you know what, no, we want to differentiate. We don't want to have the same beliefs as Christians. And this is why as Christians, we have to be mindful that our behaviors can impact people and can ruin the testimony of God. So that's why we have to be on point as believers. We have to walk filled with the Holy Spirit, led by the Holy Spirit, and not be carnal. This is on page 140, his chapter on the crucifixion of the Logos. In this chapter is where he's basically saying how the rabbinic Jews crucified the Logos. They got rid of it. Notice what he says here. One of the most evocative and revealing of these texts involves the heresy of Rabbi Akiva in a discussion of the Son of Man passage of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7 verse 13. One verse reads, His throne is sparks of fire. Daniel 7 verse 9, talking about the Ancient of Days throne. And another part of the verse reads, until thrones were set up and the Ancient of Days sat. Daniel 7 9. This is no difficulty. One was for him and one was for David, i.e. the Messiah. This is Rabbi Akiva's interpretation of Daniel 7:13. Jesus wasn't crazy saying it's about him. Christians are not crazy to invent this. Rabbi Akiva, arguably the most revered rabbi of this time period, says Daniel 7:13 is about God and the Messiah. As we learn in Baraita, non-Mishnaic Tanaitic tradition, one for him and one for David. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said, Daniel 7 is about the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, the Messiah, seated on thrones. Now, to simplify this for you before I keep reading, that is a problem for the majority of people who reject this second person being equal to God, because that's what that is suggesting. Rabbi Yossi, the Galilean, said to him, Akiva, until when will you make the Shekinah profane? See, you can't have that interpretation, Akiva. That's blasphemy, he's saying. Rather, who is sticking closer to the text? Rabbi Akiva's interpretation or Rabbi Yossi, the Galilean? One was for judging and one was for mercy. Did he accept it from him or did he not? Come in here. One for judging and one for mercy. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. And this is in the Babylonian Talmud. And that's the reference right there. It continues. There's more I'm going to show you after. But just notice, Christians didn't invent this. Now notice if you don't know, as the next thing he says, he tells you more about Rabbi Akiva, who this is. And you might be surprised what time period he's in. It says, as we see from this passage, the 2nd century Rabbi Akiva is portrayed as interpreting these verses in a way that certainly would seem consistent with the two powers in heaven. This is 100 years after the time of Jesus. And the most famous Jewish rabbi of the day holds the interpretation of the Christians. And it's the interpretation closest to the text. The crux is his identification of David, the Messiah, as the Son of Man who sits at God's right hand. Right? We talked about the right hand, the power, the Zero of God. What is he suggesting? Thus suggesting not only a divine figure, someone who comes with the clouds of heaven, and someone who sits on God's right hand, the power of God, who Isaiah 63 says what? His own arm, his own power brought salvation, but one who is incarnate in a human being as well. Boom. 100 years after Jesus, the most famous rabbi of the day agrees with the Christian interpretation of Daniel chapter 7. But somehow, Christians are the ones that invented this. Let's continue. I am the Messiah, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Mark 14:62. Hence, his objectors taunt, until when will you make the divine presence profane? See, Rabbi Yossi of the Galilean knew what Jesus said. This is 100 years after. So he's saying, Akiva, you can't hold that interpretation because that is the interpretation of the Christians. So if you, the most significant rabbi of the day, is holding this interpretation, you are helping the Christians prove their doctrine. Rabbi Akiva is seemingly also projecting a divine human Son of Man who will be the Messiah. His contemporary, Rabbi Yossi, perhaps a more assiduous reader of the Gospels, strenuously objects to Rabbi Akiva's dangerous interpretation and gives the verse a modalist interpretation. You see, they cannot have the verse saying this. Of course, the Talmud itself must recall that Akiva changed his mind in order for him to remain orthodox. Two powers in heaven is thus not foreign, even at the very heart of the rabbinic enterprise. These are the kind of things you need to know that's in the Jewish sources.